A shiny SUV eases to a stop under the noon sun, the air smelling of hot tar and coffee, and a man in a tailored suit steps out like a statue of success, briefcase clicking, phone alive with urgent tones. He moves through a plaza where a girl no older than 10 sorts through a municipal trash bin, fingers trembling from cold even though the day is warm. And she presses a folded scrap of paper to her chest and says simply, "Thank you," to a passerby who tosses away a stale sandwich. He watches for a beat, posture practiced and controlled, and then keeps walking, as if the world has a separate lane for people like him and people like her. What would you do if the world asked you to cross that invisible line for one small human life? Stay with me to see how a single moment of mercy becomes a public fight, a courtroom storm, and finally a modest kind of victory that reshapes a neighborhood and a man. The image is sharp, a suited man and a child whose palms reek of old cardboard and fried grease, and whose gratitude sounds like prayer. The choice made in that plaza would not only change reputations, but create a tiny sanctuary where trash stops being the only source of food. Pay attention, because the decision he makes will force a city, a press, and a legal system to respond. He had built himself into a machine of certainty. Jacob Bennett spoke numbers like others spoke names, one call after another, a jacket that never wrinkled, a calendar that never surprised him. He owned a skyline of investments and a reputation as someone who closed deals and never apologized. On the day he passed the girl, he was on his way to a ribbon cutting for a new tech incubator. His steps measured, his mouth rehearsing lines about innovation and impact. The plaza smelled of fried street food and sunscreen. Pigeons clucked, a bus door slammed, his cuff tapped the side of a bench, and his phone buzzed a chorus of priorities. At the corner, a child with a scalp of tangled hair and eyes that caught the light looked up, counted him as a different species, and murmured, "Thank you," for a crust someone had thrown away. He looked at the crust, at the child, at his own immaculate shoes. He hesitated. Then he reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small paper bag with a pastry from the coffee shop he had visited earlier, and handed it to her with a clipped "Good morning." She took it, smelled it as if it might contain music, and said thank you again like a small blessing. The exchange lasted 10 seconds and planted a question in the air. A bystander filmed it on a phone. The footage would circulate, and the simple act of giving trash framed as kindness would be reframed as a scandal by some and a miracle by others. The public incident unfolded like a short film. The plaza scene had sound. The squeal of bus brakes, the clink of teaspoons, the low buzz of voices, the rustle of a paper bag, the metallic click of a camera on a phone. Jacob spoke first to the girl. He said, "Here, take this." She answered, "Thank you." A passerby named Anna, who often sold handmade scarves on the square, said, "You should not be eating from the trash." Jacob replied, "I am not doing this for attention." Anna replied, "Are you sure that is enough?" Jacob answered, "I can do more." Another voice, a municipal inspector, called Mr. Bennett, "Are you aware of child safety rules?" Jacob said, "I am aware of children." Officer Santos stepped in and asked for identification. Jacob presented his card. The girl named Lena looked at him with an expression that mixed hunger and hope and said, "Will you come back?" Jacob promised, "I will try." Lena laughed softly like a wind chime and then walked away. The crowd murmured. Someone uploaded the clip. The local blog ran a headline, "Wealthy Philanthropist Feeds City Child," or another headline, "Mansplaining Charity to the Poor." The same scene produced two realities and a media itch to choose. The sensory detail lingered. The oil on the pastry, the sour smell of the trash bin, the sunlight catching on Jacob's glasses, the texture of the paper bag crinkling, the girl's small fingers sticky with syrup. That small public exchange triggered a refusal from some of Jacob's board members, who argued, "This is charity theater," and from Lena's Aunt Maria, who feared that a stranger's interest could mean trouble. That refusal would become the first public reluctance Jacob would have to face.
After the plaza, Jacob could not stop thinking about Lena and the way she had closed her eyes when she smelled the pastry, as if holding on to a private joy. The next evening, he drove back in a different car to the neighborhood where she lived. A cluster of narrow lanes, rusted gates, a humming neon corner store. He left the heater on low and walked into a narrow alley where the air smelled of damp laundry and old smoke, where dogs barked and where a sheet was pinned like a curtain. Lena sat on a milk crate, clutching a ragged stuffed bear, and a woman named Maria, her aunt, wiped a lip with the back of her hand. Jacob spoke softly. "I did not mean to brag." Maria answered, "You did not have to." Lena added, "Are you a rich man?" Jacob admitted, "Yes." Lena asked, "Are you lonely?" Jacob hesitated, "Yes." The exchanges were simple, but long and intimate, each line a thread. He listened to how Lena described nights when the heat went off and her stomach ached, and how Maria explained she worked 2 shifts at a laundry and sometimes the electricity was cut.
Because bills could not be paid. Senses crowded the scene. The dampness of the alley clung to clothes. The smell of boiled beans hung in the air. The roughness of the crate scraped Jacob's palms. The distant tinny music from a neighbor's radio offered a melancholic tune. The softness of the bear's fur contrasted with Lina's hardened knuckles. The conversation moved from courtesy to confession. Jacob offered to help with groceries. Maria, suspicious because of past charity promises that never kept, asked what he wanted in return. Jacob said nothing. He then promised to return with food and to meet with a local social worker. Lena squeezed the pastry paper as if it were a relic and asked, "Will you remember me?" Jacob said, "I will try." The intimacy of that moment began to loosen the tight seams of his world. Jacob's backstory unfolded in 3 short arcs that explained the brittle center of a man who seemed invulnerable. As a child, he had grown up in a small apartment with a single mother named Eleanor who worked nights at a hospital, and the memory of her hand on his forehead during fevers lingered as a warmth he chased in adult life. He learned to measure love in effort and scarcity, and decided early that security would be his currency. In adolescence, he lost his father to debt, and the memory of cranes and eviction notices shaped his ascent. He learned to negotiate for margins, to never look back at the mess of human need. In the present, Jacob's life was a glass tower of investments and accolades, but a private wound remained, a quiet emptiness, a sense that every metric he hit failed to fill a particular silence. This backstory sat between 600 and 800 characters, so it fit into the deeper part of his psychology and directly tied to why a single thank you for trash could move him. He had the means to act, but lacked the template for how to transform impulse into sustainable help. That lack is why meeting Lena was dangerous for him emotionally and politically, because the gesture offered a mirror to a past he had avoided. The first consequences arrived quickly and involved people who would not let a public moment remain private. Within days, journalists turned up outside Jacob's office. Reporter Hannah asked, "Why did you give her food?" Jacob replied, "I could not ignore her." Hannah asked, "Did you consider the boundaries?" Jacob replied, "I was only trying to help." At the same time, a board member named Victor sent an email demanding he avoid personal involvement. Lydia, his chief of staff, called and said, "We need a statement." Jacob said, "I will write one." Volunteers from a nearby shelter, one named Anna and another named Luis, offered to coordinate services but asked for an audit. Maria warned of charity that humiliated. Officer Santos showed up asking about child labor concerns. The scene smelled of coffee from urgent meetings, the crispness of paper statements, the faint metallic click of a keyboard, and the low hum of fluorescent lights in a conference room. The community split, some praising Jacob for noticing, and others accusing him of patronizing the poor. A small protest formed, led by a local activist named Omar, who argued public charity by elites can mask systemic neglect. Jacob faced his first public backlash. His reputation attracted both praise and skeptical commentary. The social reaction forced an early decision. Would he retreat into the safety of his office in numbers, or would he take responsibility and use his resources to create something that lasted? The conflict moved into institutional territory, and the stakes rose.
A municipal audit was requested to assess whether any of Jacob's donations violated procurement rules. A social services inquiry opened about Lena's custody and safety. The media pressure intensified with televised segments that asked whether the child was exploited for PR. Jacob hired an attorney named Rebecca and a consultant named Dr. Patel to prepare for hearings. The courtroom and the council chambers became stages, with sterile smells of varnished wood, the rustle of legal briefs, the clack of a judge's gavel, and the snap of camera shutters beyond the glass. The tension thickened in 3 distinct moments, each demanding slow breathing and decision. The first tense scene was the hearing where Judge Rivera asked Jacob why he intervened and whether he had documented plans. Jacob answered, "I did not expect this to become a hearing." The gallery murmured. The council presented a slide of an outreach plan, and the judge leaned forward and said, "You cannot act unilaterally." The moment dragged into a memory for Jacob of his mother's kitchen, with a single plate and the decision to never let scarcity define a child's life. The second tense scene was when Lena's Aunt Maria was subpoenaed by Child Protective Services and confronted with accusations of neglect. Maria sat in a small office, the air smelling of institutional cleaner and plastic chairs pressed against her knees. She trembled and remembered nights of boiling water and the way Lena had smiled through hunger. Her voice quavered, and the social worker asked, "Why did you allow her to scavenge?" Maria replied, "I had no money." The third tense scene involved the local activists at a protest turning into a confrontation outside the shelter, where a volunteer named Anna had to physically shield children from a shouting crowd. The air was filled with chants, the sting of pepper spray was threatened but not deployed, the volunteers clutched children close, and the noise felt like a storm. Each of these moments sat in the 400 to 550 character range and served to slow the narrative and examine doubt and responsibility. In court, Jacob's team argued that the private action had revealed systemic failures that demanded structural responses. The opposing counsel suggested Jacob sought attention and disregard, that his involvement interfered with municipal procedures. Testimonies came from municipal officials, from a social worker named Elena, from the shelter director named Carlos, and from Lena herself, who spoke in a voice that trembled but was clear, "I do not like stealing." Jacob testified that he had been moved to create a program. The legal process involved affidavits, audits, and a public hearing where reputation was a lever. Technical terms entered the dialogue: audit trail, custody, mandate, procurement, compliance. Yet the human scenes kept returning to small details. The creak of a courtroom bench, the chalky taste of worry, the warmth of a child's hand in a grown man's palm. The flash of cameras aimed at faces. 3 moments of tension appeared again in testimony. A social worker confronting institutional inertia, a board member whispering about brand risk, and a judge considering an injunction that could prevent Jacob from running his proposed program. Each moment required that Jacob decide whether to retreat and protect his assets or to push forward and risk his reputation for a fragile promise. He chose to push forward. The resolution grew messy and practical. Jacob partnered with a local NGO called Community Hearth, led by Carlos, and with social services, to design a small kitchen and outreach center in a converted storefront. Volunteers, Anna, Luis, Dr. Patel, and Anna from the plaza joined. They called it the Hope Pocket, a small sanctuary where meals were served and where caseworkers offered protection and custody support. Inauguration Day smelled of fried onions and fresh bread, steam rising into an overcast sky, volunteers laughing, and a microphone that squealed then balanced into clear words. The ribbon could not be perfect because the community did not want pomp, but the space opened with a low table and a shelf for donated shoes. Lena helped place a painted sign with shaky letters that read, "Hope Pocket." Conversations in that scene were practical. 8 to 10 exchanges between Jacob, Carlos, Anna, Luis, Maria, and a volunteer named Sophia, who agreed to run literacy sessions. "I will cook on weekends," said Anna. "You will teach them to read," said Sophia. "Jacob will fund the rent," said Carlos. "Maria will bring Lena every day," said Maria. "Lena will show me the mural she painted," said Jacob. The sensory world filled the room. The smell of tomatoes simmering, the sticky heat of hands kneading dough, the texture of donated blankets, the echo of children's laughter on tile, the taste of warm soup that melted into tired mouths. The Hope Pocket began to serve 50 plates a day, then 100, and slowly grew into an integrated set of services including counseling, custody assistance, and job training. The epilogue examines what happened in time and must be read as 3 stages: 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months later, with names, numbers, and impact. 1 month later, the Hope Pocket had opened its doors and served 1,200 meals. Lena attended a literacy circle run.
Maria, enrolled and steadied. Maria enrolled in a night shift at the laundry with a tutor arranged by Anna so that she could study for a certification. The municipal hotline received 30 calls about similar families, and social services allocated an emergency fund of $25,000. Volunteers included Anna, Luis, Dr. Patel, Sophia, Carlos, and a council member named Elena who vouched for the shelter. The scene smelled of mending, the small successes, the taste of fresh bread offered as a ritual, the sound of a sewing machine spinning into life, the texture of new notebooks given to children, the sight of a chalkboard with names underlined. The community began to see change as incremental but palpable. 3 months later, the program expanded to include a legal aid clinic run by Rebecca and a vocational training corner where 10 adults learned culinary skills. The Hope Pocket's attendance rose to a steady 200 people a week. Local businesses donated surplus food, and a small audit documented efficient use of funds. Jacob's company paired with the city to sponsor a microgrant program for neighborhood entrepreneurs. Lena's teacher, Miss Campos, recorded improvements in her behavior and grades, and the municipal report credited the initiative with reducing street foraging by 22% among children in the district. The sensory details persisted: the clink of utensils in a busy kitchen, the scent of coffee grounds used for composting, the softness of returned school uniforms, the sound of a small radio playing a news segment that mentioned the Hope Pocket as a model. 6 months later, the program had become a federated model with 3 satellite sites. The city passed a small budget allocation into the social services line, and Maria had secured custody arrangements and a formal job contract. The Hope Pocket showed numbers: 2,500 meals a month, 120 families touched by counseling, 30 people placed in jobs. Lena now led a small art group and painted murals on the shop's outer wall, a kaleidoscope of color that drew neighbors and volunteers like bees. Jacob and Maria stood at the opening of a new mural and watched as children traced their fingers over paint that smelled of solvent and promise. The epilogue shows concrete impact and a shift in reputation. Jacob's company began public audits of social projects championed by its foundation. A council member introduced a policy for emergency housing vouchers, and the local paper ran a long piece with testimonies from Lena, Maria, Anna, Luis, Carlos, and even Omar, who admitted the project had surprised him. There were setbacks and critics along the way. Some accused Jacob of PR, some warned about dependency, and some legal hurdles required months to clear. Yet, the transformation had turned into an infrastructural change, not only a headline. The man who had once walked past a girl's
Thank you for trash. Learn to measure impact in tables of lives changed, not only in profit margins. He learned to sit with uncertainty, to fund services without micromanaging, and to accept that help must be built with those who receive it, not over them. In the end, the plaza where they first met had a permanent bench with a plaque that read Hope Pocket in small letters, and a painted line that marked the place where Lena claimed she once found a pastry and a stranger who decided to act. If this story moves you, consider what crossing an invisible line might mean in your own city. Comment what you would do if you saw someone like Lena, and share this story so it reaches someone who can act. Because when a thank you for trash turns into sustained protection, the measure of success is not the headline, but the warmth at a table and the number of children who learn to read without carrying hunger.